Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Hashim Kumar. The UK and France will work with Ukraine to formulate a peace plan to be jointly presented to the Trump administration, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said on Sunday. Starmer's announcement came ahead of a meeting of European leaders in London as they seek to show unity following Friday's unprecedented clash between the US and Ukrainian presidents. What are the likely outcomes of this emergency summit? Well, to lay it out for us, we're joined by Andrew Danieri, resident fellow, Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Right. So, what do you make of this? Let's start at the beginning. What do you make of the spat between the two presidents?
Well, it was certainly a remarkable incident on Friday. We had really what turned into a 45-minute long press conference, joint press conference, gaggle with President Zelensky, President Trump, and as it turned out, toward the end of the discussion, Vice President Vance. Much of the discussion was relatively innocuous. I think it was clear that President Zelensky and Trump disagreed on some certain points. But then toward the end, as we all know, it got quite testy. Nothing like I'd ever seen, especially with President Zelensky and a U.S. president. But I do think that there are, despite this rupture, there are signs that things could be coming back together again between the U.S. and Ukraine, although this was probably a low point in the relationship, particularly when we consider how the Trump administration has looked very openly toward working with and talking with Russia.
Yes, I mean, of course, as you'd expect, many different points of view are being put forward on social media and elsewhere. Some saying that this was some kind of setup by the Trump administration. Would you agree?
I don't think we can really know if it's a setup or a trap or anything, but certainly, were I advising President Zelensky, I probably would have told him, that the specific points about, he went really into detail on the 2014 war, the first Russian invasion, and all the events preceding 2014, 2022, and now that sort of thing is probably best, like all sorts of diplomacy, behind closed doors. Particularly, we know President Zelensky's English has improved considerably, but I don't think he was in a position to litigate the details of something like that in front of the American media. And certainly, I mean, we know Vice President Vance has an exceedingly narrow view of what constitutes American interests, and has shown in the past that he has a certain odd antipathy towards Ukraine and towards Europe and transatlantic relations. So it wasn't the best situation, certainly. And we had J.D. Vance as well. He chided President Zelensky for talking openly and trying to chide the Trump administration to the American media. But certainly Vice President Vance did the exact same thing there.
Right. Now, moving to London now and Keir Starmer's hosting of this summit. What outcomes do you think Starmer, the French president, and Zelensky, amongst others, would like to see from this one-day summit?
Well, just a point off the top, Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron have become kind of the two diplomatic leaders, really, on the European continent and maybe even in the transatlantic region here, in their leadership on Ukraine and on getting a real sustainable peace deal that maintains Western leverage on Russia. So I think Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron have done an excellent job over the past few weeks engaging with the Trump administration, engaging with European allies, and in particular, engaging with Kyiv and President Zelensky. So those are our major positives. And I think we heard President Starmer just a few hours ago talk about how the next steps are for the UK, France, Ukraine, and possibly some other allies to come together on the contours of what real security guarantees would look like for Ukraine and how they might be backstopped by a European coalition of the willing, they called it, which is a major step forward and I think is the right way to be thinking about a real peace deal.
Understood. Now, what is it that the Europeans would bring to the table that would stop Putin from fighting?
Well, French and British troops on the ground in Ukraine, I think one of the details actually to iron out is if we were to get a French, British, and possibly Polish or other countries' coalition of the willing, where actually in Ukraine they would be stationed. I think that is a question that is one of the ones that they'll be trying to figure out. It would not make much of a difference if they were stationed in Western Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine when there were American soldiers, NATO soldiers in far Western Ukraine. So if we were to get a real deal and to backstop it and to ensure that a sustainable ceasefire holds, those soldiers would need to be further deployed closer to the front. And so that's the main thing I would say is, as Prime Minister Starmer said, boots on the ground and British planes in the air, as well as real air defense for Kyiv.
Okay, so now this is something, of course, that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has said. If we have, we will not accept troops from NATO countries in Ukraine. So this sounds like a head-to-head confrontation, doesn't it?
Well, I'd actually go back to something that National Security Advisor Waltz said today on American television. He was responding to a question about how the Trump administration has appeared to try to force concessions from the Ukrainian side without getting much from the Russian side. And that publicly has certainly looked to be true, although he said something very interesting, which was that the Russians will have to make their own concessions on security guarantees for Ukraine. Russia, we know, has maintained its maximalist goals in Ukraine. I think for too long, the US and other European countries have been a bit scared to confront Moscow in a way that would make them fully stop the invasion. So perhaps some diplomacy as well as some strong negotiating, both from the American and European sides, as well as maintaining the leverage on Russia. That's sanctions, that's troops to Ukraine, that's military aid to Ukraine, can, I think, have a difference in changing Moscow's outlook.
All right. Now, moving to NATO, there are some who say, well, and in fact, President Trump himself has said that, he's not particularly interested in protecting countries who are within NATO if they're not paying their way. Clearly, this has rattled many other member states of NATO. How should that be analysed?
Well, I think President Trump has quite a funny way of getting at a couple real problems here. I do think that, and many analysts would agree, certainly the Prime Minister of the UK, Starmer, said something to this effect today, that European allies do need to pay more. Folks that aren't hitting 2% do need to hit 2% in the short to medium term. Now, the issue here is that the countries that are most in danger of Russian aggression, that's Poland and the Baltic states, have been paying more than 2% for many years and are some of the highest spenders in the NATO alliance on defense. And so the problem comes when President Trump or other members of his administration hint that, well, while they're not going to leave the NATO alliance, that the U.S. might not defend some of these frontline states on the eastern flank. And that's an issue because they're model members of the NATO alliance. They're doing exactly what we've been asking them to do. And so I think it would be smart for the U.S. to recalibrate some of those comments and to make more clear that, no, the U.S. is prepared to defend particularly the members of the NATO alliance that are paying their share and are at the greatest risk.
But I mean, does the US have a choice? I mean, does any country within NATO have a choice, given Article 5's commitment, attack on one, attack on all?
So, yeah, there's a lot of, I would say, aura and lore about Article 5. It demands a response of some kind. It doesn't specify exactly what the response would be to an attack on one being an attack on all. So there actually is a bit of latitude in there. And this is actually a good thing for the alliance. When people talk about so-called NATO enlargement and say that, oh, NATO can't do this or can't do that because that would, antagonize Russia and trigger World War III. That's not true, because there's actually a good bit of latitude within Article 5 on how to respond to certain things. And we saw this with drones that were Russian drones that were meant to hit Ukraine actually falling across the border in Poland and in Romania as well. And the NATO alliance, I think, should have taken a stronger stance on those. But just the instance of something, hitting the borders of NATO doesn't automatically trigger World War III. Although were a real Russian attack to happen in the Baltics or in Poland, we would expect a strong NATO response backed up by the US.
Understood. Now, going back to the meeting in London, there's been, much talk of ramping up defence spending, and having a more muscular, if you like, defence strategy. The challenge, of course, is getting everyone in line. There are some countries who are missing. Hungary, Slovakia come to mind, of course, but the Baltic states too. Is Europe going to be able to present a cohesive front when it comes to defence?
Well, the good thing about defense expenditure is that sort of thing is up to the individual member states. Germany right now is a good example, having their own crazy internal debate over, oh, we can't spend more than a certain amount on our defense because there's a debt break and they can't do this and they can't do that, whereas other states like Poland and like the Baltics, and of course like the UK as well, have their own internal politics and have decided that they will spend more than 2%, or in Poland and other countries' case, well above 3 or 4%. So the issue of defense spending itself, while it does have a few kind of nerdy details in terms of cooperation with other EU allies and things like that, defense spending across borders on certain projects, it is up to the individual member states. And so countries actually have more latitude than I think they necessarily let on to spend more on their own defense.
Understood. Of course, the greater the alignment within the EU on defence spending, the more powerful the defence posture. Andrew Danieri, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good day, sir.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.